Phil Blakey was an interesting guy with a international arms sales and British intelligence background, if I remember right. Now here this is where it really starts to get convincing and amazing. So we've all heard about Jonestown. We all know that Jim Jones had this group of people, and he was in Ukiah, California, and then all of a sudden he moved to the middle of the jungle in British Guiana. And I assume we all had the same experience I had. We just sort of take that at face value. Here's this nut. He moves down to the middle of the jungle in British Guiana, but like, how did he ever choose that location? Who scouted it out? Like, what about the logistics of getting all the lumber, all the oil drums, all the everything down to the middle of the jungle in British Guiana? You got to build an airport. You got to this is a huge, huge project. Well, it turns out that this wasn't just jungle before the People's Temple arrived. It was the Shalom Project from 1973 to 1975, and Phil Blakey oversaw the engineering development of the site in its transition from the Shalom Project to the People's Temple. What was the Shalom Project? It was a CIA operation for training black mercenary guerrillas for operations in Angola. This was a CIA training site. This was not a random, unconnected site. That's just some general background. Okay, we're going to pick up Jonestown kind of as we bop along here through these crystal clear slides. Okay, we've heard part of this story. Here's J. Edgar Hoover. He's corresponding with Esterbrook, who's creating Manchurian candidates. Patty Hearst is a Manchurian candidate. Her identity of Tanya is deliberately programmed in by Donald DeFries, who's from Vacaville State Prison, which was an MK search site, which is also a site for the UCLA Violence Project. Vacaville is a CIA research site. Patty Hearst is connected down to Jolly West, who's her expert witness in her trial, who says, in effect, she's a Manchurian candidate, DDNOS level. He's the expert witness for Jack Ruby. Let's come back. Oh, Jack Ruby, some of you may recall, is connected to Lee Harvey Oswald. I went to one of the JFK assassination meetings in Dallas a couple of years ago, where a guy presented a bunch of information, including a photocopy of a letter by J. Edgar Hoover dated 1960, expressing concern that Lee Harvey Oswald had been doubled. And the FBI was on top of Lee Harvey Oswald, knew who he was, and was tracking him systematically well before the assassination. So that connects J. Edgar Hoover to Lee Harvey Oswald, which connects over to Jack Ruby. Okay, how does Wounded Knee get in there? Wounded Knee is the Indian uprising where the FBI were shooting up the Sioux Indians. Russell Means was heavily involved in that. What does Russell Means have to do with Jonestown? Well, Jim Jones was a good PR guy. When Patty Hearst was kidnapped, he offered William Randolph Hearst a program to set up a collection of money, a donation of money, to pay the ransom for the SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army. And the SLA was demanding this huge something like $170 million from William Randolph Hearst for the release of Patty Hearst. Jim Jones offered to set up this fund, but William Randolph Hearst said no. The net outcome was that the SLA also wanted food donated to the poor people that they thought they were representing in the revolution. So a committee was set up to do food distribution financed by William Randolph Hearst. According to this book, the way that food distribution was done was Jim Jones got control of the mechanism, and he brought people from the People's Temple down to be the homeless and poor people who received the food, and the same food was redistributed around the network 6 times, constantly being picked up by new People's Temple people, taken back to the distribution point. So actually only 1/6 as much food was purchased as it appeared, and the rest was skimmed by the People's Temple. Russell Means was on the committee that oversaw this operation, and Russell Means' wife was bailed out of jail in Oregon the year before at a cost of $19,000 by Jim Jones. Who was working for Disney? Russell Means works for Walt Disney. Oh, that's nice to know. So this arrow actually goes over here to Mickey Mouse. Okay, so we did Vacaville State Prison, MK Search, that's all connected into Patty Hearst, Donald DeFreeze. We've got that part. We've got MK Ultra connected to UCLA. What's that MK Ultra got to do with that Sugi U-2 base? That's the U-2 spy plane. Well, that's according to information from JFK assassination researchers that I haven't independently confirmed. That was one of the MK Ultra sites. Lee Harvey Oswald was stationed there. U-2 was the plane that Gary Powers went down in. It was a spy plane that overflew the Soviet Union. It was also used for surveillance of Martin Luther King. That's an acknowledged fact. The FBI used U-2 airplanes to keep track of him. According to a book which is a little shaky in terms of its documentation, the people who were consulted on the mental state of Gary Powers, the pilot of the U-2 that was downed, included Ewan Cameron, who was an MK Ultra contractor, who did the experimentation on Linda McDonald that I told you about earlier. Ewan Cameron was also one of the people who went over and interviewed the Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg to do mental status exams on them. So the FBI's in there fairly tight. Let's just talk about MK Ultra, MK Search assassination connections. So this is now out beyond Oliver Stone. And we're going to pick up JFK, a little bit of Jonestown, a little bit of this and that here. So we've got MK Search. Carl Pfeiffer was a contractor for MK Search and MK Ultra. One of the sites that he worked at is the New Jersey Reformatory at Bordentown, which was in some of those preliminary MK Ultra lists that I showed. Now, in Walter Board's book, Mind Control, or Operation Mind Control, he talks about Louis Castillo. Louis Castillo was arrested by the FBI, the Philippines equivalent of the FBI, on suspicion of being there to assassinate Marcos. In 300 pages of transcripts of the interrogation of Louis Castillo by the Philippines FBI that's in the possession of the JFK assassination researcher who told me where G.H. Estabrook's personal papers are, Louis Castillo describes very clearly, and this is also described in Walter Board's book, having multiple personality disorder. So here's a potential assassin of Marcos who describes undocumented multiple personality disorder, who was at the New Jersey Reformatory at Bordentown at the same time as was an MK Search hallucinogen site and an MK Ultra hallucinogen site. So we've got Lee Harvey Oswald, who's at Sugi Air Force Base, which is apparently an MK Ultra research site, who's connected over to Jack Ruby, who's connected to Jolly West, who's an MK Ultra contractor, who's the expert witness for Patty Hearst, whose Manchurian candidate identity Tanya is created by Donald DeFreeze from Vacaville State Prison, which is an MK Search site, which takes us back to the New Jersey Reformatory at Bordentown. This is all just random coincidence, as I'm sure you appreciate. Okay, how about JFK CIA mind control research connections? I might come back to Jonestown in more detail. I'm just trying to get through all these slides here. Cool, this is a very pretty little diagram with CIA at the hub, and then we've basically got a wheel going all the way around. There's a game that I saw in the newspaper called, I don't know the exact name of it, but it's basically who was in a movie with Kevin Bacon. And the purpose of the game is, you can name any Hollywood star, and within 6 steps, you can get for that person to Kevin Bacon. Because this person was in a movie with this person, who was in a movie with this person, who was in a movie with Kevin Bacon. So this is the same logic here. We can start anywhere. We can connect Jolly West to the CIA. Neil Birch is a CIA Air Force Military Office of Naval Research mind control consultant in Houston. Robert Heath is a CIA military funded brain electrode researcher at Tulane. Well, let's just go through this random assortment of individuals here. Okay, Robert Heath is doing brain electrode implant and other research for the CIA in Tulane. He publishes a paper with Bernie Salzberg. Bernie Salzberg publishes with Neil Birch, who's funded by the CIA and the military. Neil Birch publishes an edited book. Contributor of a chapter to that book is Jolly West, who describes the UCLA violence project in the book edited by Neil West. Jolly West interviews Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby shoots Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, well, that's interesting. That's the end of the story. Except, let's run back around this way. Robert Heath publishes with Francisco Silva, who's still alive, who I'm going to try and interview in Baton Rouge. Francisco Silva is a Cuban psychiatrist who left in the random year of 1959, which is when Castro took over, to take up residence in Louisiana and work and publish with Robert Heath, who told my secretary that Francisco Silva is a very wonderful person. In the Warren Commission documents, there's uncorroborated testimony by Lee Harvey Oswald that in 1963, prior to the assassination, he lived with Francisco Silva and was temporarily employed at the hospital where Francisco Silva worked. I'm just sort of playing mind games with you. This is all just meaningless coincidence. Okay. Project Paperclip and Mind Control Research. Okay, CIA, we heard about Alan Dulles already. He is the director of the Central Intelligence Agency before George Bush was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, which in turn was before George Bush was the president. Alan Dulles is head of the CIA during the MKUltra program and obviously was aware of it and oversaw it. The CIA goes to Alan Dulles, which goes back to this Reinhard Gehlen guy, who is the German spy master that was recruited by Dulles to become our boy spying against the Russians, our enemies who were our friends. Reinhard Gehlen is, in effect, a Nazi war criminal. Comes down to here. Project Paperclip is a fully documented project that's one of a group of projects, including Project, I think, National Interest, Project 63. There's something with the word blood in it, Bloodstone. There's a bunch of other projects, but Paperclip is the best known one. There's several books about it. Project Paperclip is a program set up by the CIA and military intelligence to bring Nazi war criminals into the United States through a mechanism that rooted them around the State Department. State Department rules were that if you're a Nazi war criminal, you couldn't emigrate to the United States. But there was a mad scramble at the end of the Second World War involving the U.S., Canada, British, French, German, and Russian governments who were all scrambling to get their hands on German scientists. And there was all kinds of like recruiting drives and et cetera, et cetera. And American teams would actually go into like the Russian sector and go into a place where German scientists were being held and sneak those guys out of there. So it was quite an intense little party that was going on. In Project Paperclip, this is totally documented, all types of scientists were brought over to the United States. Film experts, ball bearing experts, lubricants, rockets, every aspect of science and technology of interest to the military. It included some somewhat obscure people like Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun was head of the rocket program. He was the guy who was in charge of the V-2 rockets that were used to bomb Britain, which were created at the Mittelwerk. The labor for the Mittelwerk was supplied from Camp Dora. When the American troops liberated Camp Dora, they found 6,000 corpses on the ground. It's estimated that about 20,000 people were worked to death out of Camp Dora building the V-2 rockets. Werner von Braun is documented as being on site at the Mittelwerk at least 20 times and being at meetings of V-2 oversight personnel where the use of prisoners being worked to death was discussed and condoned. And the workers would sometimes attempt to sabotage the rockets by urinating on the parts or tampering with the rockets. The typical response to that was that the entire work crew would be instantly hung in their work tunnel. He was also a member of the SS, and there's a correspondence on U.S. space program stationery to a journalist in which Werner von Braun admits that he was SS officer. So he was a Nazi war criminal who couldn't be brought in through a normal kind of visa process. Another person who was brought in through Paperclip or another related project was Albertus Strughold. Albertus Struckold is regarded as the father of aviation medicine. There's a library named after him at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. He was honored by the Daughters of the American Revolution for his contribution to aviation medicine, and the Texas State Legislature declared a one-time state Memorial Day named after him in, I believe it was the 1960s. Albertus Struckold was not a nice person. People on his own administrative level, people who reported to him, and people that he reported to were all tried and found guilty at Nuremberg of war crimes. He was not even interviewed by the U.S. lawyers responsible for that sector of Nuremberg. The types of experiments that these people did included things like putting people in a pressure chamber and dropping the pressure instantly to about 60,000 feet to simulate somebody being blown out of a cockpit if they were a U.S. pilot. What would happen then is they would claw at their faces, experience excruciating pain, and die, either actually die or almost die. The ones who died would be taken out of the chamber, their heads would be cut open, then their heads would be submerged underwater, their brains would then be sliced open to determine whether there was air emboli in their cerebral arteries. Another type of experiment done by these people was to attempt to find an antidote to seawater so that downed German pilots in the North Sea could drink seawater. So these people were given forced feedings of seawater for days on end, which then would be doctored with various different substances to see whether any of the substances would prevent the subjects from dying. This is major, full-tilt, Nazi doctor, war crime stuff, and probably over 1,000 of these kind of scientists were brought in under Project Paperclip. The Nazi war criminals were examined by a team of psychiatrists, including Ewan Cameron, who did LSD and mescaline research, who was an MK Ultra contractor. LSD and mescaline research was also funded by MK Ultra, and mescaline research was done by the Nazi war criminals in the prisoner of war camps. So Ewan Cameron probably got the bright idea of LSD and mescaline research from the Nazi war criminals. And according to this book, which was not real rock solid in its documentation, he was still in network up in the early 1960s when the U-2 pilot went down. So the only people who are missing from this fully, completely documented history are the psychological warfare experts. It is not plausible that the only kind of scientists out of the full range of military expertise that were not brought over was the psychological warfare experts. And a guy who was a Deep Ops character in Vietnam described being out in the field and coming across U.S. and VC personnel who were all totally wasted on some sort of hallucinogen trip. And their job would simply be to extract these guys and leave the VC who are just completely out of it on the ground. He told me which specific location in the United States would be the most likely place to find some of these paperclip psychological warfare experts, so I'm going to pursue that. Let's just take a look at the brain electrode implant research. Now, let's say it's just not believable that the CIA and the military have been creating Manchurian candidates. It's too much. It's science fiction. Well, what do we know for a fact that they've been doing? We know that they've been giving kids, if you do milligrams per kilogram or micrograms per kilogram, big-time street doses of LSD, days, weeks, and months and a year, up to years in a row. We know that they've been implanting non-therapeutic brain electrodes in children as young as 11 years old on an experimental basis. And we know that they've been wiping out people's entire personal histories with 102 ECT treatments and massive sleep induction through drugs for no therapeutic reason whatsoever. But we don't think they would go as far as creating a Manchurian candidate. So it doesn't add up. What we know for an absolute documented fact is that they've gone way beyond monkeying around with some amnesia barriers and new identities. So what's the story on brain electrode implant research? Oh, here's a name you might recognize. Well, brain electrode implant research was funded by the CIA and MK Ultra. in conjunction with the Office of Naval Research. There's a lot of joint funding of various projects by Office of Naval Research and the CIA. The Office of Naval Research funded both Neil Birch and the CIA. And Neil Birch published that thing by Jolly West. Jolly West started the UCLA Violence Project, which was going to be at Vacaville, which is where Donald DeFreeze was. He recruited a brain electrode implant psychiatrist who was part of a brain electrode implant team at Harvard, Frank Irvin, to be part of the UCLA Violence Project. He denies in his chapter in the book by Neil Birch that there was any intention to do brain electrode implants, but the available evidence suggests that actually, in fact, the plan was to stick brain electrodes in some of these prisoners at Vacaville, and the concept was that you would use this for tracking their whereabouts, and if they were off restricted locations or there was a certain kind of discharge from their brain, you could then transmit a signal to them to arrest their behavior so that they could be picked up by the police. He's also funded by Army Intelligence. Army Intelligence funded Neil Birch. Army Intelligence funded Robert Heath at Tulane, who did brain electrode implant research. We saw him on the previous page. The Office of Naval Research funded Jose Delgado at Yale, who did brain electrode implant research. This is the guy that Harold Leaf sent a patient into. His experiments include sticking electrodes in brains, as I mentioned, and then pouring in various types of hallucinogens to see what would be the effect on their perception, their behavior, and electrical activity in the brain. This guy, Jose Delgado, who's tightly in network, he's famous for a videotape of a bull charging at him, and then he pushes the transmitter box, which sends a signal to the electrode implanted in the bull's brain, and the bull turns away. He also has a series of papers, which are in my Jose Delgado file, where he does this kind of research on cats, and he refers to the cats that he's got brain electrodes in that he's controlling by a transmitter as mechanical toys, which by loose association reminds me of a book called Man the Mechanical Misfit, written by G.H. Estabrooks. He also describes a technical innovation in an 11-year-old boy who had brain electrodes implanted for non-therapeutic reasons. Previously, you had to have wires connecting the transmitter box directly to the electrode terminals that were sticking through the skull. In this 11-year-old boy, however, Jose Delgado had figured out how to have a remote transmitter without a direct wire connection. He describes pushing a button in this otherwise normal 11-year-old boy's brain transmitter box, and the boy starts being confused about his identity, wondering whether he's a girl, and talking about wanting to marry Jose Delgado. He pushes another button and this behavior stops. Another experiment with a 16-year-old girl who looks like maybe a mild borderline, premorbidly, involves sticking these brain electrodes in, and there's actually pictures in the paper that you photocopy when you go to the medical school library that's in a journal on the shelf, where in one picture she's got this vacant, stupid grin on her face, push another button on the panel box, and she's pounding the wall. So they're showing actual photographs of markedly different behavioral states, totally controlled by remote transmitters and brain electrode implants. But, you know, these guys wouldn't be using hypnosis to create Manchurian candidates. Let's look at the temporal lobe epilepsy military mind control research story just for a minute. Let's try and think about the history of multiple personality disorder. What are some of the bogus reasons why MPD is not real? Well, one of the big arguments is it's really temporal lobe epilepsy. So we know that temporal lobe epilepsy has been used as one of the arms of Manchurian candidate denial. Okay, well, here we have how that little network works. We got Robert Heath, who's doing non-therapeutic brain electrode implants, plus brain electrode implants on temporal lobe epilepsy subjects. That's all funded by military intelligence and the CIA. We've got temporal lobe epilepsy as a phenomenon. Frank Irvin, who's recruited by Jolly West to the UCLA Violence Project, and Mark Sweet write a book called Violence in the Brain, where they're describing doing brain electrode implants, experiments on people with temporal lobe epilepsy. One of their subjects had a very unusual form of temporal lobe epilepsy. He was driving a truck in Los Angeles and blanked out and came to in Phoenix. So actually, these people were doing brain electrode implants on multiples. Jolly West said, well, it could be alcoholics, but the description, remember this guy drove a truck from UCLA to Phoenix. That's a little bit much for alcohol blackout. But some of the other case histories clearly sound dissociative in nature, but they're calling them temporal lobe epilepsy, just like Jolly West said Jock Ruby had temporal lobe epilepsy. There's this misinformation in the literature that DID is actually due to temporal lobe epilepsy, and there's 9 authors of a series of papers in the early to mid-1980s pumping this DID is really temporal lobe epilepsy line. So this shows you how this research works, because I haven't done this, but the hypothesis is now these 9 authors are somehow going to be in network. So the odds are the 9 authors of the papers published in the 80s saying that DID is really just temporal lobe epilepsy, they're going to be in network in this mind control opioid network somehow. I just haven't researched that up. Okay, borderline personality disorder, when multiples are really just borderlines, is another backup strategy. How does borderline personality disorder tie up with military mind control research? Well, DID is iatrogenic. They're really just borderlines. Martin Orn says that. Richard Offshee says that. Martin Orn worked for MK Ultra. MK Ultra is connected to MK Naomi. MK Naomi was also conducted at Edgware Arsenal. Edgware Arsenal is a place where Amadeo Marazzi worked. Amadeo Marazzi did LSD research for the Air Force in Minnesota. And it was funded by Air Force Intelligence. Robert Heath also did LSD research. LSD research was done by Nazi scientists and war criminals. Nazi scientists and war criminals were imported into Edgware Arsenal frequently, and one of the people that I researched was, I forget his first name now, Wagner Jorg.
Good morning and welcome to another International Connection, and happy Easter to everybody out there. We are in part 3 of a lecture by Dr. Colin Ross. This lecture was called The CIA and Military Mind Control Research, Building the Manchurian Candidate. And this is the first segment in an extended series on mind control in Canada. Next week we'll be featuring an interview with Dr. Colin Ross. If people are interested in where to get hold of audio tapes of this program or transcripts, you can give me a call at 595-1655 during the show or shortly after. This lecture was given at the 9th Annual Western Clinic Conference on Trauma and Dissociation in Orange County, California on April 18th, 1996. And it's very suspicious, I would say, that we have in the news the cult group that has just so-called supposedly committed mass suicide in San Diego, and immediate comparisons to Jonestown, as we're going to hear today, and as we heard last week, of Jonestown's connections to the CIA mind control programs. And also the Solar Temple suicides as well in Quebec. And if you remember, there was news coverage. For example, Radio Canada announced that the Solar Temple had financed itself through arms smuggling, laundering its money through BCCI, which is well known for its CIA connections as well. So I think people have to ask themselves what's behind these events, and not to take it at media's face value. Now we're going to play Dr. Colin Ross.
Another person who was brought in through Paperclip or another related project was Albertus Struikhold. Albertus Struikhold is regarded as the father of aviation medicine. There's a library named after him at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. He was honored by the Daughters of the American Revolution for his contribution to aviation medicine, and the Texas State Legislature declared a one-time state Memorial Day named after him in, I believe it was the 1960s. Albertus Struikhold was not a nice person. People on his own administrative level, people who reported to him, and people that he reported to were all tried and found guilty at Nuremberg of war crimes. He was not even interviewed by the U.S. lawyers responsible for that sector of Nuremberg. The types of experiments that these people did included things like putting people in a pressure chamber and dropping the pressure instantly to about 60,000 feet to simulate somebody being blown out of a cockpit if they were a U.S. pilot. What would happen then is they would claw at their faces, experience excruciating pain, and die, either actually die or almost die. The ones who died would be taken out of the chamber, their heads would be cut open, Then their heads would be submerged underwater. Their brains would then be sliced open to determine whether there was air emboli in their cerebral arteries. Another type of experiment done by these people was to attempt to find an antidote to seawater so that downed German pilots in the North Sea could drink seawater. So these people were given forced feedings of seawater for days on end, which then would be doctored with various different substances to see whether any of the substances would prevent the subjects from dying. This is major, full-tilt, Nazi doctor, war crime stuff. And probably over 1,000 of these kind of scientists were brought in under Project Paperclip. The Nazi war criminals were examined by a team of psychiatrists, including Ewan Cameron, who did LSD and mescaline research, who was an MK Ultra contractor. LSD and mescaline research was also funded by MK Ultra, and mescaline research was done by the Nazi war criminals in the prisoner of war camps. So Ewan Cameron probably got the bright idea of LSD and mescaline research from the Nazi war criminals. And according to this book, which is not real rock solid in its documentation, he was still in network up in the early 1960s when the U-2 pilot went down. So the only people who are missing from this fully, completely documented history are the psychological warfare experts. It is not plausible that the only kind of scientists out of the full range of military expertise that were not brought over was the psychological warfare experts. And a guy who was a deep ops character in Vietnam described being out in the field and coming across U.S. and VC personnel who are all totally wasted on some sort of hallucinogen trip. And their job would simply be to extract these guys and leave the VC who are just completely out of it on the ground. He told me which specific location in the United States would be the most likely place to find some of these paperclip psychological warfare experts, so I'm going to pursue that. Let's just take a look at the brain electrode implant research. Now, let's say it's just not believable that the CIA and the military have been creating Manchurian candidates. It's too much. It's science fiction. Well, what do we know for a fact that they've been doing? We know that they've been giving kids, if you do milligrams per kilogram or micrograms per kilogram, big-time street doses of LSD, days, weeks, and months and a year, up to years in a row. We know that they've been implanting non-therapeutic brain electrodes in children as young as 11 years old on an experimental basis. And we know that they've been wiping out people's entire personal histories with 102 ECT treatments and massive sleep induction through drugs for no therapeutic reason whatsoever. But we don't think they would go as far as creating a Manchurian candidate. So it doesn't add up. What we know for an absolute documented fact is that they've gone way beyond monkeying around with some amnesia barriers and new identities. So what's the story on brain electrode implant research? Now, here's a name you might recognize. Well, brain electrode implant research was funded by the CIA and MK Ultra in conjunction with the Office of Naval Research. There's a lot of joint funding of various projects by Office of Naval Research and the CIA. The Office of Naval Research funded both Neil Birch and the CIA. And Neil Birch published that thing by Jolly West. Jolly West started the UCLA Violence Project, which was going to be at Vacaville, which is where Donald DeFreeze was. He recruited a brain electrode implant psychiatrist who was part of a brain electrode implant team at Harvard, Frank Irvin, to be part of the UCLA Violence Project. He denies in his chapter in the book by Neil Birch that there was any intention to do brain electrode implants, but the available evidence suggests that actually, in fact, the plan was to stick brain electrodes in some of these prisoners at Vacaville, and the concept was that you would use this for tracking their whereabouts, and if they were off restricted locations or there was a certain kind of discharge from their brain, you could then transmit a signal to them to arrest their behaviors so that they could be picked up by the police. He's also funded by Army Intelligence. Army Intelligence funded Neil Birch. Army Intelligence funded Robert Heath at Tulane, who did brain electrode implant research. We saw him on the previous page. The Office of Naval Research funded Jose Delgado at Yale, who did brain electrode implant research. This is the guy that Harold Leaf sent a patient into. His experiments include sticking electrodes in brains, as I mentioned, and then pouring in various types of hallucinogens to see what would be the effect on their perception, their behavior, and electrical activity in the brain. This guy, Jose Delgado, who's tightly in network, he's famous for a videotape of a bull charging at him, and then he pushes the transmitter box, which sends a signal to the electrode implanted in the bull's brain, and the bull turns away. He also has a series of papers, which are in my Jose Delgado file, where he does this kind of research on cats, and he refers to the cats that he's got brain electrodes in that he's controlling by a transmitter as mechanical toys, which by loose association reminds me of a book called Man the Mechanical Misfit, written by G.H. Estabrooks. He also describes a technical innovation in an 11-year-old boy who had brain electrodes implanted for non-therapeutic reasons. Previously, you had to have wires connecting the transmitter box directly to the electrode terminals that were sticking through the skull. In this 11-year-old boy, however, Jose Delgado had figured out how to have a remote transmitter without a direct wire connection. He describes pushing a button in this otherwise normal 11-year-old boy's brain transmitter box, and the boy starts being confused about his identity, wondering whether he's a girl, and talking about wanting to marry Jose Delgado. He pushes another button and this behavior stops. Another experiment with a 16-year-old girl who looks like maybe a mild borderline, premorbidly, involves sticking these brain electrodes in, and there's actually pictures in the paper that you photocopy when you go to the medical school library that's in a journal on the shelf, where in one picture she's got this vacant, stupid grin on her face, push another button on the panel box, and she's pounding the wall. So they are showing actual photographs of markedly different behavioral states, totally controlled by remote transmitters and brain electrode implants. But, you know, these guys wouldn't be using hypnosis to create Manchurian candidates. Let's look at the temporal lobe epilepsy military mind control research story just for a minute. Let's try and think about the history of multiple personality disorder. What are some of the bogus reasons why MPD is not real? Well, one of the big arguments is it's really temporal lobe epilepsy. So we know that temporal lobe epilepsy has been used as one of the arms of Manchurian candidate denial. Okay, well, here we have how that little network works. We got Robert Heath, who's doing non-therapeutic brain electrode implants, plus brain electrode implants on temporal lobe epilepsy subjects. That's all funded by military intelligence and the CIA. We've got temporal lobe epilepsy as a phenomena. Frank Irvin, who's recruited by Jolly West to the UCLA Violence Project, and Mark Sweet write a book called Violence in the Brain, where they're describing doing brain electrode implants, experiments on people with temporal lobe epilepsy. One of their subjects had a very unusual form of temporal lobe epilepsy. He was driving a truck in Los Angeles and blanked out and came to in Phoenix. So actually, these people were doing brain electrode implants on multiples. Jolly West said, well, it could be alcoholics, but the description, remember this guy drove a truck from UCLA to Phoenix. That's a little bit much for alcohol blackout. But some of the other case histories clearly sound dissociative in nature. But they're calling them temporal lobe epilepsy, just like Jolly West said Jock Ruby had temporal lobe epilepsy. There's this misinformation in the literature that DID is actually due to temporal lobe epilepsy, and there's 9 authors of a series of papers in the early to mid-1980s pumping this DID is really temporal lobe epilepsy line. So this shows you how this research works, because I haven't done this, but the hypothesis is now these 9 authors are somehow going to be in network. So the odds are the 9 authors of the papers published in the 80s saying that DID is really just temporal lobe epilepsy. They're going to be in network in this mind control old boy network somehow. I just haven't researched that up. Okay, borderline personality disorder, when multiples are really just borderlines, is another backup strategy. How does borderline personality disorder tie up with military mind control research? Well, DID is iatrogenic. They're really just borderlines. Martin Orn says that. Richard Offshee says that. Martin Orn worked for MK Ultra. MK Ultra is connected to MK Naomi. MK Naomi was also conducted at Edgeware Arsenal. Edgware Arsenal is a place where Amedeo Marazzi worked. Amedeo Marazzi did LSD research for the Air Force in Minnesota, and it was funded by Air Force Intelligence. Robert Heath also did LSD research. LSD research was done by Nazi scientists and war criminals. Nazi scientists and war criminals were imported into Edgware Arsenal frequently, and one of the people that I researched was, I forget his first name now, Wagner Jorg, who apparently is the son of the Wagner Jorg who won a Nobel Prize for treating syphilis with malaria. I haven't researched that up fully, but he came over to Edgware Arsenal, and I have him publishing research. I have him documented as being a German university professor in the 1930s and 40s, showing up at Edgware Arsenal and publishing research on antidotes to chemical warfare weapons, and saying that he regrets the extremely long period of time during which it was impossible to publish this research data. So he did that research at Edgware Arsenal, which overlaps with the time that Amedeo Marazzi was there, who did LSD research at the University of Minnesota. Another person who did LSD research is Paul Hawk. Paul Hawk worked for the CIA and is one of the inventors of the term borderline personality disorder. So this is a little bit hokey, this one, but it just shows you, the theme here is not that there's a military intelligence conspiracy to cover up Manchurian candidate creation with a myth of borderline personality disorder. The point now is sort of a more global general meta point, which is this whole network of old boys in psychiatry and psychology who are covertly funded, who are part of the military CIA intelligence mind control network, are very influential in the history of psychiatry in a kind of nebulous fashion that just permeates the whole field, that isn't part of this sort of one-to-one correspondences like I've been showing before. So it's a matter of the whole mindset of psychiatry, how we think about borderline, how we think about temporal lobe epilepsy. What are we going to react to MPD like? Well, we're going to react to MPD because, so it's a little bit more vague, it's a little bit more global, it's a little more general. But the point is that the history of psychiatry in the second half of the 20th century has undoubtedly been strongly skewed, not by an agenda that has to do with academic research, not by the best interest of clients, not by ethical psychiatry, but by an intelligence agenda. My beef is not with the intelligence community or the CIA, it's with the psychiatrists and the psychologists who've created a little loophole where they can step out of normal ethical oversight, violate the Hippocratic Oath, get away with it, not talk about it, and just like the conspiracy to keep incest under the carpet, this is all conspired and kept under the carpet, not by 12 guys in a room at Langley who are doing the planning, but just by this pervasive old boy network that's keeping the mind control secret down, just like it kept the incest secret down. So that's another reason this is important and needs to be uncovered. That's the end of the slides. Now I'm going to come back to Jonestown a little bit and fill you in on Jonestown, and then I see that I'm way ahead of schedule, which is fine because I've got a lot more to tell you, plus you can ask a whole bunch of questions and we can have a discussion. According to this Jonestown book, remember that there's a connection between Patty Hearst is being kidnapped by Donald DeFreeze, who's mind controlled by Colson Westbrook, who's a CIA Psywar expert, and then there's the food relief program for the ransom by Jim Jones, who's being hassled by William Randolph Hearst newspaper that ties into Russell Means being on the board. Well, according to a person who survived the White Night at Jonestown, Patty Hearst's boyfriend, Stephen Weed, was on site at the People's Temple in Ukiah and observed talking to Jim Jones 3 months before the kidnapping. So if that is true, I mean, that just blows the coincidence conspiracy theory out of the water. It's too much not to be all connected up. According to the book, there's pretty solid documentation that Jim Jones was recruited by the CIA way back in the 50s, and he was a coercive persuasion brainwashing expert who had some churches in Cincinnati and then moved out to California. He specialized in coercive persuasion on blacks and Native Americans. Almost all of the people at Jonestown were not white except the elite who survived. And he was on site in 2 European, South American countries, I think Brazil and British Guiana, as a CIA undercover operative, doing typical CIA operations as part of government overthrow by stirring up left-wing factions, stirring up labor, distributing leaflets, and so on. So he was actually part of standard CIA operations going way back into the 50s. The evidence in favor of it actually being a drug experiment is pretty weak. He says there was drug A, drug B, and placebo. And the point of the experiment was, do either of the active drugs enhance the voluntary completed suicide rate of the brainwashed subjects? But he doesn't really provide any documentation to support that. He just sort of pulls that out of nowhere, so that's not very plausible. Also, he talks about MKUltra in a non-scholarly way because MKUltra had already stopped, so it wasn't technically an MKUltra operation. There's a lot of, I can't remember all the detail in the book, but there's a lot of elaborate detail about, for instance, Jim Jones visited Castro. There's a lot of connections between the CIA being the site for Jonestown in British Guiana before they went there, and all kinds of visiting back and forth from CIA station in the capital of Guyana to the People's Temple. Like I said, one of those daughters in the Leighton family was escorted out of Jonestown just before White Night by the CIA station chief. And it just builds up like that. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of these kind of documented pieces of information. There's a whole bunch of stuff about particular people who were assassinated by the People's Temple, and a bunch of numerological type code and letter type code for how these people were selected and how their last names mirrored the method by which they were killed. There's a whole just vast ton of detail that leaves me with the net conclusion that it's beyond coincidence. Whether it actually was a medical experiment is not really clearly established, except the most compelling fact is the method of delivery of the drugs. Every night, every member of the Jonestown commune had to go to the kitchen and eat one cookie in front of personnel. And he says the cookie is where the drugs were delivered. So I would say the net conclusion is that it's probably more than 50% likely that there was some sort of heavy CIA involvement in Jonestown, whether or not there was a drug experiment. In terms of how many people actually committed suicide, according to this book, actually only a minority of people committed suicide. Many were shot or injected with a cyanide. Only a minority actually drank it voluntarily. And when you look at the configuration of bodies on the ground, these are people who just drank, died, and fell on the ground. They're all lined up in orderly rows. There's a whole deal about how one of the Leighton family members her identity was switched with somebody else who had lung cancer. And she was actually escorted off the grounds on the grounds of having lung cancer, but it was somebody else who had the lung cancer. And there's substitution of bodies. There's a claim that the guy who was identified as being Jim Jones was not actually Jim Jones. So you have to read the book to get the whole wealth of detail. But I'd say it's fairly compelling and persuasive, which takes us back into how come all these guys who are connected into network tend to be experts in mind control, brainwashing, coercive persuasion, destructive cults. And why is it that destructive cults appear to specialize in creating Manchurian candidates? So you just keep going round and round this network, and the more you research into it, this is only like part way along the journey. If you actually had a team of like 10 researchers, you would end up with like 50 of these slides, with some of it speculative, but every connection fully documented on 50 slides. So another curious twist on this story is the history of LSD. One of the things that goes on is there's always information and disinformation. One of the strategies for disinformation is what's called a limited hangout. A limited hangout is when you let out a little bit of the truth, and then you go, well, see, we fessed up, but actually you only let out 3%. And the purpose of the limited hangout is to cover up the rest. So there's always a limited hangout going on. Every time a bunch of stuff is declassified, that's only the tip of the iceberg. If we take a look at the history of LSD, something that was not taught to me when I was a psychiatry resident is who were the original acid heads. Could have been like maybe Beatniks or maybe Allen Ginsberg, or could have been Ken Kesey maybe. No, the original acid heads in North America were the leading figures in psychiatry. The people who imported LSD into North America were the CIA and the military. It didn't get here through street or drug dealer routes. It got here through official military CIA mind control research mechanisms. And the CIA at one time actually considered buying up the world's supply of LSD from Sandoz. But like I said, their alternative backup was to contract with Eli Lilly to provide a secure supply of LSD. So these guys were on acid trips in the first half of the 1950s. People who first got turned on to LSD as subjects in military experiments included Gregory Bateson, Allen Ginsberg, Ken Kesey, probably Timothy Leary. Gregory Bateson was married to Margaret Mead, who was funded in her anthropological work by the CIA. There's a whole other dimension of this, which is funding. This is a fact. In another story about anthropology, a little glimpse of which we capture from Raymond Prince being funded under MK Ultra to go study the Yoruba. This is called Study of Mind Control Techniques by Witch Doctors Around the World. Now, Raymond Prince's hypothesis is that actually it's just a way to go undercover into a foreign country and gather information about the culture and establish contact with possible agents and recruits. But the CIA, as part of its proper operations in the Cold War, has had to gather a tremendous amount of data on the stability of different societies and countries that are likely to tip over to communism, which involves sociology, economics, military analysis, and anthropology. Anthropology and languages and linguistics are all part of the operation. So all these people who are the original acid heads are the psychiatrists. And the psychiatrists, when you read the LSD-sponsored symposia, the guy who's the archivist currently for the American College of Psychiatrists, whose name is Sidney Mallett, so I plan to contact. The American College of Psychiatrists is this old boys power club in American psychiatry that I got into because I got a fellowship from them as a resident. No, I don't think it was CIA funded. Unless Meade Johnson was functioning as a cutout. The money supposedly came from Meade Johnson. But that's the way the network works. I mean, that's a joke, but it could be. You never know. So this guy who's the archivist historian in one of these CIA symposia in the early 1960s talks about how he was turned on to LSD by Paul Hawke, who's the guy who is responsible for the term borderline personality disorder, who killed the tennis pro with mescaline. Well, all these guys are writing and talking about LSD as the hot thing in psychotherapy. They are totally on board with it, and usually they're talking about sub-hallucinogenic doses, like 50 milligrams, 75 milligrams, as loosening up the ego and causing these amazing treatment responses, like curing long-term alcoholism in a single LSD psychotherapy session. They're all getting funded by it, they're getting perked by it, they're going to trips, they're meeting their buddies, they're going to conferences, they're getting published, they're getting books edited. It's all just part of the whole program. Nobody in psychiatry is saying bad stuff, dangerous stuff, street drug, protect the youth of America. They're not talking like that. All of a sudden, boom. It's a narcotic, and it's outlawed by the FDA. What is the initial response of all of these gray-haired fathers of psychiatry to making LSD an illegal substance? Protest. It's a bad thing. It's robbing us of a powerful psychotherapeutic agent. It's crippling our research efforts. These guys were hung out to dry. They were used by the intelligence agencies to gather therapeutic use of LSD, interrogation use of LSD, psychotomimetic use of LSD. And then when they had done their job, LSD was just canceled from academia. It was made illegal. And then a whole disinformation campaign went along with that, whereby LSD was transformed from this wonderful therapeutic agent whose use was advocated by the major leading figures in psychiatry into this horrible thing that made our children jump out of windows and busted up their chromosomes. That's called a disinformation campaign. And it caught the leaders of psychiatry totally by surprise, which is hard to believe since psychiatrists are such clever political strategists in general. Okay. What about this whole creating Manchurian candidate stuff, which we see now for a fact has been going on since the Second World War, and according to Esterbrook's, even back to the First World War? So we now have established for a proven fact that that was going on in the Second World War, and the CIA was working on it in Artichoke and Bluebird 51 to 53. Well, the Korean War only started in 1950. The disinformation is that our boys went over there, they got shot down, they got captured, the communist Chinese worked on them with these strange techniques we don't understand. The person who coined the term brainwashing in a book was named Edwin, I think was his first name, Hunter. He's a career CIA case officer. This was a term that was coined by the CIA to explain what was happening to our boys in North Korea, who were making bogus statements about germ warfare activities they've been involved in. Now, it could be that part of the communist brainwashing strategy was to talk to these guys about the ethical impropriety of biological warfare bombing they actually had been doing on North Korea. At any rate, they come home as Manchurian candidates. We're all bent out of shape because our boys are talking communism, and so we say that we have got to start studying this stuff reactively and defensively because of what the commies are doing. That is the disinformation myth that's been adhered to by the military intelligence community steadfastly from the Korean War up till the present. It's totally bogus. It's disinformation. It's not a fact. It's a made-up story to cover up the fact that actually we had operational offensive use of this psychological warfare technology already in place in the Second World War. Got a major disinformation campaign which has basically fooled mental health professions and the general public concerning brainwashing, concerning LSD. Fortunately, those are the only two examples in human history. This analysis does not apply to the false memory movement. There's no way that it could conceivably be possible, you'll all agree, that there could be any nervousness in the intelligence community about Manchurian candidates spilling out into civilian psychotherapies, and that a disinformation program based on false memories would be required. That's obviously absurd. Nobody but a CIA conspiracy nut would ever suggest that. So I can guarantee you that that thought has never even crossed my mind until it just spontaneously appeared at this moment. So you see, actually, in fact, the idea that there could be a deliberate disinformation campaign element to the false memory movement is perfectly plausible, consistent with history, and to be expected. There is bound to be some sort of disinformation strategy if, in fact, Manchurian candidates have been leaking out into civilian psychotherapies. So here we have, with all of this documentation, all of this proof, we know that it is perfectly possible that people we are seeing in therapy who are claiming to be victims of systematic military mind control experimentation are telling us about what actually happened to them. However, I'm not a single step further ahead than I was 4 years ago on actually documenting that any single individual patient in treatment actually, in fact, was involved in these mind control experiments. There is no linkage at all from the current patients in treatment to this documentation. So whether we're ever going to get that or not, I don't know.
America Online has on site, and there are a number of men that are writing in about mind control in the military.
Okay, so America Online has a site called Psych Online, yeah. And
in some of the forums, the groups,
right.
There is a group called Mind Control in the Military.
Okay. So Mind Control in the Military is a chat group on the internet. So that's like a bulletin board more? Those of us who are not internet wizards are having trouble with this vocabulary. But anyway, you're able to access through America Online onto the internet, or it's an America Online? On Psych. Okay. And there's a bunch of websites. Apparently there's a lot of info about this, in the web and the internet and America Online and elsewhere. But the problem is, like, I don't go to chat rooms that much, but the little bit I've gone is it's mostly just totally banal and silly and boring and a waste of time. So when you go into this stuff on mind control, how much just garbage are you going to get, and how much solid stuff that you can pursue and document are going to get is my question. I have no idea what the answer is. But as we all know, the truth is out there.
I'm curious, you said you haven't had an opportunity, or you haven't had a case where you've been able to document. I'm curious, how would you go about doing that?
How would I go about documenting that a patient that I currently have in treatment or somebody else currently has in treatment, in fact, was involved in that kind of experimentation. Well, here's how the documentation has gone so far. The person has, by the way, I've done Freedom of Information Act requests on Monarch at all intelligence agencies, and they've all denied it exists. The patient has apparently no source of contamination for specific Monarch memories, but has the word Monarch in her mind and has a very detailed Monarch mind control type scenario memories. Her father basically abused her domestically and ritualistically, and then took her over to the mind control people. How she got there, what the transport mechanism was, plane and car, the location's all vague because she appears to have been drugged out during transport. Is it possible that her father could have been this kind of person? Well, I have his military service record, which I got through the Freedom of Information Act. I have a letter from him in prison where he's imprisoned for mob crime connections. I've got a mother and a sister corroborating the domestic incest, a sister with some patchy corroboration of ritual abuse and military mind control memories. I've got the father personally connected to Jack Ruby. That's as far as it goes. It's sort of circumstantial, intriguing. So the way that I would attempt to document it would be if the person tells me, most people can't tell you the specific name of the doctor. But if somebody gives you the specific name of a doctor and gives you a specific location, and then you can establish that this doctor actually existed, then you can establish that, in fact, the doctor was a CIA employee. Then you can establish that this person's father was imprisoned by the FBI as part of a mafia raid by looking at the journal articles that the patient has. Then you're starting to get closer and closer. So it's your basic investigative reporting type stuff. Name a specific base. Okay, what do you know about the base? How did you get there? Tell me about some buildings. Tell me about personnel. Describe the uniforms. What was used? And then if you can get another subject who is at the same time, that's just the way it is. It's your basic investigative reporting, which is way beyond being a therapist. I mean, there's no therapeutic obligation to do this. This is a mega beyond duty to take collateral history. But I don't think there's any mystery as to how it would proceed. And it'll proceed probably in the same way as the history of declassified information has gone since the Second World War. In about 1988, stuff was released to the Senate and the Congress and then was released to the press about all these radiation experiments. But like, nobody did anything. It didn't even get into the newspapers. It's been in the public domain for 5 years before it finally hits the newspapers. Now I've got this government report that's 900 pages on all the radiation experiments, includes giving radiation to children and radiation to pregnant mothers and the children of those pregnancies dying of leukemia by age 5. This is huge, big stuff. There was just, everybody was apathetic, didn't think it was really newsworthy, didn't even put it as a little trailer item, you know, in the New York Times. But this is no longer vague. We know the specific names of the people, when they died, whether it was plutonium or what it was that was injected, the names of the doctors, the medical schools it was done at, and it's all teed up for compensation. The government has set up a whole compensation mechanism. If we look at the Tuskegee syphilis study, anybody ever heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study? Tuskegee syphilis study is worse than creation of Manchurian candidates. It was set up in Tuskegee, which is Georgia, right? Or Alabama? Georgia. Alabama. In the 1940s. The experiment is you've got 400, they're all rural, 1940s, dirt poor, black guys with active syphilis, 400 of them, and 400 controls. These people are followed prospectively without treatment into the 1970s. The people who are involved in the Tuskegee syphilis study include a huge long list I can't remember all the details on, but it includes like the County Medical Society. The administration of the study in the 60s was actually taken over by the Center of Disease Control, the Surgeon General, the American Heart Association. All kinds of people were witting, knowledgeable, and aware of the study and approved its ongoing nature well into the 60s and even into the 1970s, in complete violation of all known medical ethics. Well, okay, so that was kept kind of secret. Nobody heard about it except some of these medical bigwigs. No, I have a 1965 paper that I photocopied at the medical school called Untreated Syphilis in a Male Negro, a 20-Year Follow-Up. This stuff is published right in the medical literature. It's looking everybody right in the face. What happens when you have 400 illiterate, rural, black guys with active syphilis untreated for 40 years? Well, the outcome of the experiment is, you'll be very surprised to hear, they don't do too well, they develop a lot of disease, and they die young. They do another thing. They breathe air. There's another behavior that we can predict of these guys, that is, they eat food. Going down the list, they urinate and defecate. Continuing on with basic human functions, they have sexual intercourse with women. Anybody who's been to medical school will tell you it is 100% guaranteed that if you take 400 black guys with syphilis and do not treat them for the rest of their lives, you are guaranteed to be creating cases of congenital syphilis. The entire medical community knows this for an elementary fact that you learn in first-year medical school. It's published in the medical literature, and it's condoned by all levels of the Old Boy Network in world medicine. This is totally unbelievable and completely factual. So, like, this Manchurian Candidate stuff is like the little Mickey Mouse psych stuff. It's not even heavy duty. So all of this, I mean, you can, the nurse who was the head of the Tuskegee syphilis study throughout its duration actually got an award from the Public Health Service because of her work on the Tuskegee syphilis study. So now, some of these guys, the individual guys, have gone and testified at the Senate. You can read the book called Bad Blood, and these guys are named as individual human beings. Which individual human beings who are victims of military mind control research do we already know? Harold Blower, the tennis pro who was killed. Frank Olson was killed because he jumped through a window because he took LSD mixed with Cointreau, administered by Sidney Gottlieb, administrative head of MKUltra that I've talked to on the telephone. When was the Olson family compensated? He died in like 1955 or something. They were compensated by the president in 1977, I think it was. The reason they figured out what happened, this is the children and the surviving mother, the reason they figured out that in fact this was not just a simple suicide was they read the Rockefeller report on CIA activities published in 1975, in which the case was described without him being named. So they're reading the Rockefeller report, and they realized that their father actually was killed by experimental LSD, and they're compensated for $750,000. One of the people who testified at the committee hearings in the Senate in 1975 was a technician for Amadeo Marazzi, who was the guy who was the head of Edgeware Arsenal, where Paul Hawke got his LSD and mescaline from, who was funded by the Air Force while he was at the University of Minnesota. His research assistant, whose name is Mary Ray, was given a dose of experimental LSD, which resulted in an acute psychotic state, for which he was admitted to the hospital, for which I have the medical record. And I'm in contact with a lawyer. I'm going to go up and interview her and get her story in more detail. She talks about a room that was involved in the LSD research, which was called the Leaf Room. So when you were on your acid trip, administered by Amadeo Marazzi, you would be taken into the Leaf Room, which is a room, all surfaces of the room were totally covered with leaves. This is weird stuff. She also is connected into a bunch of other stuff that actually is just like, I'm not going to go into all of it because it's a little weird, but it's 2 hops from Mary Ray to Iran-Contra. So she is a real person who exists. I know her lawyer. I talked to her lawyer on the phone. I'm going to fly up there. I'm going to interview her. I have the medical record. And the way this works is the stuff that happens now is not going to be declassified for 20 or 25 years. Eventually, we will have the names of people who were victims of these experiments in the 70s and 80s and the 90s. We already have their names for the 50s and the 60s, not really into the 70s. We have the names of specific people who were victims of the Tuskegee syphilis study and the radiation experiments into the 70s. So that's just the way it goes. It's just, you're just pushing back that curtain, and there's always this lag time because you're relying on, you equals the intelligence community, are relying on public apathy. And, oh, well, it was back in the Cold War, and it's different now, and we joined the Boy Scouts of America, and we don't do that anymore. So there's always a disinformation strategy for why it happened a long time ago. We don't do it now. We're very regretful. And we're so regretful that, in fact, we agreed to compensate these victims. In the radiation experiments, it was Oregon, Oregon. There's a prison in Oregon where men were paid to be subjects to participate in radiation experiments. And what they had done was their testicles were irradiated, so they would get paid a certain fee to participate in irradiation of their testicles. Special arrangements were made so that Catholics didn't participate in the study because they couldn't use birth control, therefore they might give birth to genetically mutated children. So it had to be only non-Catholic participants. Then there was an extra fee that was a little bit fatter if you would agree to have your testicle biopsied to see whether the radiation was dropping your sperm count. When 9 of these people pressed their case to the state legislature in Oregon in either the late 70s or early 80s, in its magnanimity, the legislature agreed to compensate them for a total of $2,000 and some for all 9 subjects. So this is the way it goes with trying to document this stuff and get it made public and identify the specific individuals. It's a big, slow job. And when you make Freedom of Information Act requests, it's like interacting with any federal bureaucracy. In fact, the CIA has been extremely helpful, extremely polite, very courteous. And when I went to the CIA reading room in Washington, which was a very unusual experience, well, let me just tell you the story because it's kind of a good story. So here I am, Canadian psychiatrist, going down to the Eastern Regional Conference, and a day early, I pop over to the CIA reading room to look at the MK Ultra documents to figure out which ones I want to order at 10 cents a page, which they then ship to me, which arrives at my office from UPS with Central Intelligence Agency stamped in the corner. I'm wondering who thinks that's weird. So I show up, and it's just this building in Virginia on a street. It's completely unrecognizable, doesn't look like anything. I get dropped off there. I walk in, like, whew, there's all these guys in uniforms. And I hear I'm this civilian. And on the wall it says, secured telephone, CIA and DIA only. And I'm kind of standing around, and some guy says, good morning, sir. And I say, well, I'm here to read some CIA documents. I'm supposed to show up at this location at this time, and here's the letter. And they're going, CIA, geez. And then it's like, who are we going to phone? Are you supposed to tell somebody you're here, or how's this supposed to work? Well, I don't know. I was just told to show up here. Says, well, we don't know who is supposed to meet you. So then I say, well, could I use your phone? Says, yeah, not that phone. This phone over here. So then I phone my secretary, like, what's the telephone number of the contact person? So she gives it to me, and I say, well, you're supposed to contact this person at this phone number. Oh, it's okay. We found out who it is. They're going to be down in a minute. So then I sign in. I'm escorted up the elevator. It's all like military guys, and I'm sitting on the elevator thinking, now, which one of these guys is doing surveillance on me? I come up to the floor, and we're walking along, and it's a federal building. Like, the floor is under repair. There's all kinds of construction stuff lying around and construction guys. And I go walking down the corridor accompanied by the CIA person, and I go into the first room, which has got like a steel vault door, and it says Secured Area Treasury Department. So I go into that room, they close the door. I'm now in a secured area. She says, okay, sign in here. I think I signed in, I forget. Then I go through another secured steel door into a second secured area, because I can't enter that secured area except from another secured space. And then I sit down, and they bring in all the documents on a little cart, and she gives me like 15 or 20 pencils, beautifully sharpened. And there's a notepad and everything. Here's, you order which documents you want at the end of the day. And there's a woman who's at least 80, if not 85, who's a retired volunteer sitting there watching me all day. But I'm in the room that I'm in that's a secured space. The doorway is open back to the hallway that I came down from the elevator to go into the first secured space, to go into the... So then I'm sitting there working away on this huge amount of documents all day, like just work. Somewhere in the middle of the day, this old woman, so I'm thinking, now, is this old woman trying to pump me for information? What's her report going to be back at the end of the day? She says, well, what's that stuff you're reading? And I'm trying to act cash. I just say, well, it's just a bunch of mind control documents from the 50s and 60s. She says, well, is that stuff classified? I said, no, it's declassified a long time ago. She says, so what do they need me here for? I go, I don't know. And I stopped talking to her and focused down on my paper. So then I get distracted by a couple of black guys who are walking down the corridor, have something to do with the construction. The 85-year-old white-haired woman who's watching me has to go to the restroom, so they're assigned to watch me from the door. And they're like some black guys who start joking around, oh, this guy's pretty dangerous. We'll have to watch him. And then at the end of the day, I leave. That's my experience. So, but the main contact person is like very friendly, very polite, very efficient, very helpful. And it's through this process. I mean, they've given me these documents. They're the ones who've made it possible to prove that the CIA has been creating Manchurian candidates. But I've got all these other requests in on MK Search and all this MK Nomi and stuff, and I'm going to put one in on Stargate. If you want to do a request on an individual, it turns out that you have to establish his place and date of birth, his full name, his date of death, the fact that he was an American citizen, and you have to have public documentation of his death before they will do a search, which is proper protection of people. So you got to do all of this background research to find out, like, when did Carl Pfeiffer die and where did he die, and get a newspaper clipping from Atlanta to document that. Then you send all that information into them, and you ask for information on this particular guy, and they send you back the MK Ultra document that you already have, that you already know is due to him, except now his name's not whited out. So a lot of it is just kind of like dealing with the federal bureaucracy, and it's just really, really, really slow. And they say, like, we've only got 2 secretaries and we've got 1 million requests and we're too overloaded and we don't have our new computer system and we can't get this stuff to you, but we're working on it. And it's just a very, very, very slow, laborious process to get this stuff, especially if it's already declassified and it's indexed, then you can get it fairly quickly, like the MK Ultra stuff. If it's just being organized, it isn't yet officially declassified, then you get in a line and you're piggybacked on top of the first requester. When the first requester gets the stuff, you'll get it as well. And so, like MK Search, I've been waiting for a couple of years already. So it's like, trying to change the way agriculture is administered in the United States. It's this huge, laborious process. You're just trying to egg the bureaucracy on and on and on and on. But just to kind of repeat the editorial comment, basically, I don't have a beef with the intelligence agencies. My beef is with the psychiatrists and the psychologists. Other question or comment at all?
Do you know whether or not if you are being surveyed or...
Do I know if I'm being surveyed? Well, I've been approached by millions of people at conferences. I don't know if any of them are operatives or not. I've had no, like, negative, scary, frightening, intimidation, threat. My office has not been broken into, doesn't look nothing about mail tampering, nothing's gone missing. No patients have done anything really dangerous and weird towards me. Nobody's disappeared. No dead chickens on my doorstep. Nobody's hustled me into a black car and all of a sudden I'm in Topeka, Kansas, and I don't know how I got there. Nothing like that has happened. So I just assume that if it hasn't happened by now, it's already too late. Like, what's the point? So part of this whole story, which I didn't get into, is the personal side of it, is how do you work your way through all this material and get more and more and more and more and more of these connections and not succumb to terminal paranoia. And it's really just sort of a zen of investigating military mind control. You just have to stay centered and decide not to be paranoid and not let it get to you. And because you can get off into, like, how many witnesses to the JFK assassination are dead, and what about Pan Am 103, and what about Timothy McVeigh's computer chip in his buttock, and you can really get out there real fast. When he was first arrested, Timothy McVeigh said that he had a computer chip implanted in his buttock. So, but on the other hand, I would assume, like, I hope that the intelligence agencies are not so fast asleep. I mean, basically, I was saying to John, it's narcissistically injurious to think that they're not paying any attention at all. I can't take that. And I know for a fact they have a file on me because I've filed millions of Freedom of Information Act requests. And the other thing I know is that I got my green card in 1994, at the highest level of green card there is. It's a level where you don't have to even have a job or any visible sign of report. And I got this immigration lawyer who put my whole CV and all my publications and letters from people and stuff together. And so that involves, obviously, a security screen by the State Department, which means connected to Justice and connected to the FBI and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I know I've been screened through, all that kind of mechanism and come out. In fact, I had to go to Calgary for the green card, and the consulate there came up and shook my hand and said, "Boy, I bet you we got a lot of dissociation disorders right here. We could really use you." I think they're trying to pretend that they're never going to get uncovered and just carry on with life and enjoy their retirements. Overall, what's going on now? I assume that there's still a lot of funding of research through cutouts with unwitting investigators. I assume there's a bunch of witting investigators. There's another, let's see here. We've got 10 minutes. Let me tell you about another arm that I know is going on currently. That's artificial intelligence research. I know that, for instance, Marvin Mirsky at MIT, in his book, The Society of Mind, he acknowledges extensive Office of Naval Research funding. That goes back to John Lilly, who is tied into the LSD network, who treated dolphins with LSD, who's involved in communication with dolphins. Dolphins, for a documented fact, have been used to swim up the ships, to blow them up with bombs attached to the dolphins in the Vietnam War. We hear weird stuff from patients sometimes about dolphins and mind control. John Lilly's tied into the LSD network, and it got him attending CIA-sponsored LSD symposia. He invented the flotation tank. Flotation tank research is in network and all the sensory deprivation stuff and mixed in with hallucinogens. He wrote a program on meta-programming in the human computer, which is an early artificial intelligence treatise that basically defines a modularity model of the human mind, which is the dominant model of neural networks, all that area of artificial intelligence, and a whole bunch of different Office of Naval Research funding. And that is ongoing up to the present. There's Office of Naval Research funding for that kind of research. Also for rat physiology, rat psychology research that has to do with modularity of brain functions and modularity of memory, which all is directly relevant to creating Manchurian candidates because you want to know the modular organization of the brain. Which hypothesis now? No, there's a very good question. You're assuming that I might have the answer. The answer is, if the hypothesis is that, now I'm not saying like everybody on the False Memory Syndrome Advisory Board consciously is aware of this. Most of them are like totally out to lunch, I've never heard of it or thought of it. The point would be that the intelligence agencies have somehow penetrated the false memory movement and are trying to spin it in that direction and amplify it for those purposes. And candidate people for intelligence oversight would include Martin Orne, Jolly West, Richard Oxley, etc. Maybe Michael Persinger. So if that's the hypothesis, and the basic thing is to cover up government Manchurian candidates, why are the patients all coming in with SRA stories? Well, that could be accidentally related and just part of a cultural hysteria and not real. The other paranoid conspiracy theory is that the intelligence agencies subcontract with the cults to prime the children to be good subjects for really, really complicated Manchurian candidates. Because if you just start with G.I. Joe at age 19, you can't, get intensely polyfragmented, multi layers of defense system in place very easily. So one of the pieces of logic I didn't mention is if you go back to J.H. Esterbrook's in your Second World War, he's creating one alter personality in adult recruit. Okay, let's look at the stage the computers are at in the Second World War and run up to 1996. We have to postulate that the technical advance and the increase in complexity in mind control research and operations has at least somewhat paralleled the complexity of artificial intelligence, all the rest of science, etc. So if they're still doing it, it's got to be a lot more complicated. And you've got to you can't get to a lot more complicated from a foundation of a normal 18-year-old military recruit. So that's the ultimate paranoid conspiracy theory. It's a matter of opening windows in the program. The first window that comes open is the SRA. The window behind that is the military mind control. Alternatively, the whole SRA thing could itself be deliberate disinformation that's been implanted in the culture. Broaden the question a little bit. What's my political recommendation on what should be the legal liability of government-induced Manchurian candidates for criminal acts that they perpetrated? And I would say that we should have a double amnesty program. And this is for strategic reasons. It's like politics is the art of the possible. Some people could say this is unethical and this is like, caving in and playing the game. I think that we have to have a double amnesty program for any criminal acts conducted by government-induced Manchurian candidates in the course of their government operations, and also amnesty for their handlers. Because if we don't have that, then the drive to keep it all covered up is too great. So we can't get this wound down. My basic argument is that I think this is, the intelligence community has been sold a bogus bill of goods by these guys like G.H. Esterbrook and all his heirs down the line. It's overkill, it's unnecessary, it's ridiculous. You can just drop it, and there will be no operational loss. Do I know that for a fact? I haven't got the faintest idea. But that's what I would propose to them. They could do their own analysis. If we're going to stop it and let it come out into public, that'll never happen if the individual handlers and operators in the intelligence community are going to be nailed in public and personally responsible. So there has to be a double amnesty program, but then there has to be financial compensation for the victims who get identified. That is less likely to happen if the compensation comes out of the intelligence budget. Therefore, it ought to come out of general federal funds and not to reduce intelligence community funding. Otherwise, you've set up systemic disincentive to this stuff ever being declassified.